Well, it's been a month since the CrossFit Games, and athletes didn't just give their blood, sweat and tears, but also their blood and urine for the drugs tests. And yet, we still haven't heard anything from CrossFit HQ. Am I the only one that's getting a little worried? Welcome back to the channel. So today I wanted to talk about PEDs once again, but with regards to the CrossFit Games themselves, looking a little bit at what happened earlier on in the season, what we know happened at the games, and then the lack of information that's come from CrossFit, and even an interesting post that they've put up recently that I feel is quite brave, all things considered. But please let me know what you think in the comments. Are we going to hear of some failed drugs tests in the coming days, or is the CrossFit Games now well and truly in the past and we are looking ahead to the next season already? So let's start by just reminding ourselves what happened before we even got to the games. So the season was going along quite nicely. We had discovered that many people didn't know how to count shuttle runs. We'd seen a bit of confusion on the leaderboard, but all in all, things were going well, particularly considering the big shake-up and the fact that Dave Castro was no longer the main man in charge of the CrossFit Games. And then we moved into the semi-finals. Now, before we even got to the final week of semi-finals, we started hearing about failed drugs tests. Well, we didn't hear about them from CrossFit, but what we were seeing was athletes coming forward to let us know that they'd been informed they'd failed the drugs test. First one we would have seen was probably Jalen Franklin, who did an interview with Clydesdale Media. The interview didn't really do any favors for his appeal process because it kind of made him look more guilty than if he hadn't said anything. And then we had some people like Nicolas Joyel, who was on the Savan podcast, or people were talking about a lot for the fact that he had actually just owned up to it when he got caught and admitted that he had knowingly taken a PED. And then we heard that other people like Phil Toon had also failed their drugs test. We saw a whole load of teams. We saw some confusion about the drug testing protocols at some of the semi-finals. So there was a lot of talk about drugs in CrossFit. There was the idea of, does CrossFit have a drugs problem? Now we're going to come back to all of this discussion a little bit later. But first, let's talk about timelines. So CrossFit have said it takes about 3 weeks for the turnaround on the test to the results, to kind of us hearing about it. And we saw that to be more or less the case. So we mentioned Jalen Franklin. So he competed at the MAC. And the MAC took place May on the 27th to 29th. And then his failed test was reported on the 20th of June. So about 3 weeks later. But it's now been 4 weeks since the CrossFit Games, and we haven't heard anything. Now, as I said before, we had a lot of positive results through semi-finals. So one way of looking at this could be, well, semi-finals caught all the cheaters. If they got caught at semi-finals, they didn't progress to the games. That makes sense that then when people are tested at the games, they're all clean and we didn't hear of anybody failing their drugs test. There is, however, a problem with this reasoning, or I would say two major problems with that line of reasoning. The first would be the test itself, because one of the criticisms we heard leveled against CrossFit and their drug testing protocol is that they were only testing urine and not blood, and if they also tested blood they would have caught more people. Well, immediately after the games, a judge reached out to me to let me know that at the games they were testing both blood and urine. And then when I started putting this video together, I actually reached out to an athlete that is an elite athlete that made it onto the podium at the games, and they confirmed that they were tested and that it was both blood and urine that they had to give. So that means potentially there could be someone that made it through semi-finals, tested clean, but with the addition of having the blood tests, is popped for some substance. But we haven't seen that or heard of that yet. But the bigger surprise that we haven't heard anything is there is another pool of athletes that have not been tested earlier in the season. And that is, of course, the Masters categories. So we have multiple Masters categories and multiple podiums, both male and female. And one of the things that was being used to kind of defend what was going on this season, when we were talking about the fact that so many people had popped during semi-finals and this was unprecedented, well, someone would tell you, well, no, that's not the case. There have been previous years where more people tested positive. Now, while that may have been true, it was incorrect at that stage of the games. What they're referring to is a completed season when the Masters athletes had also been tested at the games, and the majority of those positive tests were coming from the Masters categories. Now, I'm not saying that to be fit at 50 you have to be on drugs. It's just the historic data is showing that generally the Masters athletes tended to test positive more often than the elite individuals, which is why the Ricky Garage situation was so shocking. So we've had all these Masters athletes tested, and once again, 4 weeks later, we haven't heard a peep from CrossFit. So are we to assume that everyone passed their test? So what now? Well, maybe I'm impatient. Maybe in a day or two, CrossFit HQ will finally release a statement. But if I'm being honest, it does make me a little nervous. For example, CrossFit put out a post just the last couple of days about Ricky Garard and talking about his redemption and that he is the first athlete to come back from this 4-year ban, having been on the podium, being stripped of that position, now 4 years later to once again get back on the podium. And it's pitched as, this incredible story. And it is an incredible story, whether you love it or hate it. It could also be a PR nightmare for them if he fails another drugs test. But maybe they don't worry about that because they've already had the results back and they know he hasn't failed the drugs test. But why can't we be told that? If all the podium athletes have tested clean, could we not just have that announced? Could CrossFit not just tell us that, don't worry, the podiums are fixed. All those athletes, they passed their test. Because I know that would make me feel better. And to be honest, until then, I think I'm just going to keep refreshing the news and announcement page on the CrossFit website just to see if they put out any information about any failed drugs tests. And I guess if we get to February, we start the open for the new season, I'm going to have to just assume that everyone that was tested passed their test. But let me know what you think. Are we going to hear of some failed tests in the future? Have you already put this year's games behind you and you are now looking to the next season? I'd love to know what you think about that. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in a future video.